The official story is straightforward. 19th century civic buildings were designed according to function. City halls needed council chambers. Hospitals needed wards. Schools needed classrooms. Each room had a purpose, and each purpose appeared in the architectural plans. But when you walk through certain buildings erected between 1790 and 1910, you'll find something else. Rooms that don't appear in any ledger. Spaces built with the same care as the rest of the structure. Same materials, same craftsmanship, same integration into the floor plan, but with no documented function. No official use. No administrative record explaining why they exist. In Manchester, the 1877 Town Hall contains 14 rooms across 3 floors that appear in no municipal register. In Philadelphia's 1901 City Hall, there are 23 spaces, some as large as ballrooms, that were finished, furnished, and then left out of every operational document. The Boston Public Library, completed in 1895, has 11 rooms in its original wing that staff discovered only during renovations in 1983. They had been sealed behind original walls, accessible only through unmarked doors. These aren't storage closets or mechanical rooms. They're proportioned spaces. High ceilings, windows, ventilation designed for occupancy. And across North America and Britain, they appear with unnerving consistency. This is a documentary exploration of architectural evidence. What follows is not a claim about conspiracy or deception. It's an examination of physical structures, public records, and the space between what was built and what was written down. Some of what you'll hear may challenge conventional narratives. Some may align with alternative historical frameworks. All of it is drawn from accessible sources: building surveys, municipal archives, architectural journals, and restoration reports. What remains is a question of interpretation. The standard explanation holds firm in most historical scholarship. These rooms were service areas, later repurposed or forgotten. Construction often outpaced documentation, especially in periods of rapid urbanization. Administrative records were lost, burned, or simply never created with the rigor we expect today. It's a reasonable position, but it struggles with scale. Take the 1893 Cook County Courthouse in Chicago. Original blueprints filed with the city show 340 rooms. A 1978 preservation survey counted 417. That's 77 additional spaces, each between 200 and 800 square feet, that were built, finished, and used for purposes no archive explains. The construction budget matches the built structure, meaning funds were allocated. But no line item names them. No meeting minutes discuss them. No inspection reports reference them. They exist in 3 dimensions. They don't exist on paper. In the Liverpool municipal buildings, completed in 1866, there are entire corridors that appear in no floor plan submitted to the city council. These aren't wings added later. The brick, the plasterwork, the gas line installation, all original. All consistent with the rest of the building. But when the council approved the design, these sections weren't included. When the building opened, they weren't mentioned. When journalists toured the facility, they weren't shown. Yet staff used them. Furniture was moved in. Daily operations occurred. And then, at some point, their function stopped being referenced. This pattern repeats across dozens of major civic buildings constructed in the same 50-year window. Courthouses, libraries, hospitals, asylums, custom houses. Buildings erected by different governments in different cities with different architects and contractors. But with the same kind of omission. The timing alone creates friction. The 1870s and 1880s were a period of aggressive municipal record-keeping. New bureaucracies formalized everything. Fire codes, building inspections, occupancy limits. Even furniture inventories were logged with compulsive detail. These were not administrations that forgot to document whole sections of their own headquarters. Yet documentation stops at certain thresholds. In the 1881 New York State Capitol, there are rooms built directly into the legislative wing, finished with marble, connected to central heating, fully integrated, that appear in no state record until a 1952 infrastructure review mentioned them as historically unlabeled spaces. No legislator ever referenced them. No budget amendment allocated their use. They were simply there. And when researchers began asking why, the response was consistent. They were likely multipurpose rooms or areas for future expansion or administrative overflow that never required formal designation. But that explanation encounters a problem when you examine the design. These rooms weren't bare shells. They were purpose-built. Specific ceiling heights, acoustic treatments, custom ventilation. In some cases, built-in furniture, benches, desks, shelving that couldn't be moved. Features that suggest deliberate function, not flexible space. The Boston Custom House, finished in 1849, has 6 rooms in its basement with floor drains, reinforced walls, and a separate entrance from the street. Restoration records from 1913 describe them as finished chambers of unknown original use. The drainage suggests wet work, possibly printing, chemical storage, or heavy washing. But no customs function required that. No import inspection process involved it. And Boston's port records make no reference to any operation that would. So what were they for? Across the Atlantic, the same questions emerge. The 1868 Birmingham Council House contains 5 ground floor rooms accessible only through the building's rear loading area. Original construction. Same stonework. Same gas fittings. But no council record mentions them. No departmental assignment. No maintenance log. When a 1920s renovation crew opened them, they found original furniture still inside. Yes, filing cabinets. Chairs arranged as if for meetings. But no files. The furniture had been used, were patterns, ink stains, dust compressed into the grain. But whatever had been stored there was gone. And whatever had been discussed there left no record. It's a detail that sits uneasily in the mind. Not because it implies anything sinister, but because it implies organization, intentionality. Rooms built for something specific, used for that purpose, and then quietly removed from the administrative narrative. And when that pattern appears across multiple nations, multiple building types, and multiple decades, always in the same narrow historical window, it starts to feel less like oversight and more like a system. The infrastructure tells a different story than the paperwork. And nowhere is that contrast sharper than in the civic buildings of industrial America and Britain between 1840 and 1900. These weren't just structures with a few unexplained rooms. They were facilities engineered for capacity that didn't yet exist. Consider the Philadelphia Waterworks, completed in 1815. It was designed to supply 3 million gallons per day to a city whose population at the time required roughly 400,000 gallons. The official explanation is forward planning, anticipating growth. But the system didn't reach projected demand until 1873. That's 58 years of operational overcapacity. Pumps running below efficiency. Pipes pressurized for loads they wouldn't carry for decades. Maintenance costs for infrastructure the city didn't need. It's not impossible. It's just expensive. And it wasn't unique. The 1825 Erie Canal was built wide enough to accommodate commercial barge traffic that didn't exist in upstate New York for another 40 years. The lockworks were over-engineered, depths and widths exceeding the dimensions of any vessel then operating in the region. When it opened, much of the canal ran empty. Observers noted the eerie quiet. All that capacity. All that stone and water. Waiting. By the 1860s it was justified. Growth had caught up. But that's a long time to maintain a system no one's fully using. The same pattern shows in Britain. The London sewer system, designed by Joseph Bazalgette and completed in 1865, was built to serve a population of 4 million. London's population in 1865 was 3.2 million. Bazalgette famously said he doubled his estimates to be safe. But that safety margin meant the city was operating and maintaining tunnels, pumping stations, and treatment capacity for 800,000 people who didn't live there yet. That's not unusual ambition. That's structural commitment to a future the present couldn't see. And it happened again. And again. The 1871 Chicago Water Tower was designed to pressurize a distribution network serving 500,000 residents. Chicago's population in 1871 was 298,000. The system didn't reach full capacity until 1895, 24 years later. For nearly a quarter century, the city maintained pipes, valves, and reservoir systems scaled for double its actual need. Across the Atlantic, the 1877 Manchester Assize Courts were built with holding cells for 200 prisoners. Manchester's average daily court prisoner count in the 1870s never exceeded 60. The cells were used but only partially. The rest sat empty, cleaned, maintained, inspected, for decades. Why build for 200 when you're processing 60? The standard answer is growth projection. Victorian administrators were optimistic. They believed in expansion. They built ahead of demand because they expected demand to arrive. But projection doesn't explain uniformity. When you compare dozens of these projects across the US and UK, a strange consistency emerges. They weren't just building big. They were building the same way big. The ratios repeat. The overages cluster. Infrastructure for populations 40 to 60% larger than current need. Administrative buildings with 25 to 35% more rooms than documented functions. Storage facilities with capacity wildly exceeding inventory. It's as if they were all working from the same assumptions. The same future. The same invisible baseline. Take rail infrastructure. Between 1850 and 1880, hundreds of rail depots were constructed across the American Midwest and the British Midlands. They shared a peculiar trait: platforms designed for trains longer than any passenger or freight service then running. The 1869 Union Station in Worcester, Massachusetts, had platforms for 12-car trains. The longest scheduled service was 6 cars. It stayed that way until 1901. In Derby, England, the 1840 Trijunk station had similar proportions. Platforms for 10-car freight. Scheduled freight rarely exceeded 5. The extra length wasn't symbolic. It was functional. Switching infrastructure, signaling, even the placement of water towers assumed those trains would eventually arrive. And they did, decades later. So the projections were correct. The cities grew. The populations increased. The demand materialized. But the accuracy itself becomes the question. How did so many different municipalities across 2 continents, in an era before centralized statistical modeling, all arrive at such precise long-term forecasts? They didn't have census bureaus with predictive algorithms. They didn't have economic modeling software. They had local administrators making educated guesses. And yet those guesses, across dozens of cities, hundreds of projects, consistently landed within a narrow margin of eventual reality. The administrative buildings show the same foresight. Courthouses built in the 1870s had clerk offices for departments that wouldn't be created until the 1890s. The rooms existed first. The functions were assigned later, as if the architecture anticipated the bureaucracy. In Boston's 1865 Old City Hall, there were entire floors designed for municipal departments that didn't exist yet. Water management, public health, zoning enforcement. These weren't federal mandates. They were local administrative innovations that emerged gradually across the 1880s and 1890s. But the building already had space for them. Rooms of the right size, right location, right configuration. 40 years before anyone officially needed them. The same phenomenon appears in storage. Grain elevators built in the 1850s along the Erie Canal were sized for harvests that wouldn't occur until mechanized farming reached full adoption in the 1880s. The 1854 Darts elevator in Buffalo could store 55,000 bushels. Regional wheat production at the time generated less than 30,000 bushels annually in surplus. The facility operated at half capacity for decades. But when production exploded in the 1880s, the elevator was exactly the right size. It's easy to see this as validation. They built it and the demand came. Success. But it raises a deeper question. What kind of coordination allows independent projects in different regions under different administrations to all scale their infrastructure to the same future? There's no evidence of a central planning authority. No multinational task force dictating capacity standards. These were local decisions, made by local governments, hiring local engineers. Yet the outcomes align. In the 1881 Liverpool Lime Street Station expansion, the freight depot was doubled in size to handle imports that didn't exist. The Liverpool shipping ledgers from 1881 show consistent but modest trade volumes. The new depot could process 5 times that. It didn't reach operational capacity until 1903, 22 years. The Philadelphia Navy Yard expansion of 1876 added dry docks and machine shops for a fleet size the U.S. Navy wouldn't commission until the Spanish-American War in 1898. The yard sat largely idle for 2 decades. Maintained. Staffed. Ready. For what? These aren't isolated oddities. They're systemic. A pattern of infrastructure preceding the conditions it was designed to serve. And when you layer in the unexplained rooms, the spaces built with care, used without record, and then left undefined, you're not just looking at optimistic planning. You're looking at inheritance. Whether that inheritance reflects an earlier, more centralized phase of coordination, or a shared template emerging from common administrative culture, or something else entirely, that's where interpretation begins. What's undeniable is the physical evidence. Buildings that don't match their own records. Infrastructure that predates its purpose. Systems that work backward from the future. And all of it concentrated in the same narrow window, the same decades, the same regions, the same era that some researchers have begun referring to not as a period of explosive growth, but as a period of reactivation. The term Tartaria doesn't appear in mainstream historical scholarship as a nation or empire. It appears on maps, hundreds of them. European cartographers from the 16th through 19th centuries used it to label the vast interior of Eurasia, a geographic designation for territories that were incompletely documented, politically fragmented, and culturally diverse. It was never a unified state. It was a label of convenience, a way to mark space that didn't fit neatly into European political categories. But in recent years, the term has been reinterpreted, not by historians, but by researchers examining architectural and infrastructural anomalies in North America and Europe. They've begun using Tartaria not as a place, but as shorthand for a hypothesis, that the buildings and systems from the mid-1800s weren't entirely new construction, that they represented, in some cases, adaptation or completion of infrastructure already present. It's a minority view. It contradicts the dominant narrative, but it attempts to answer a question the dominant narrative struggles with. Why does so much 19th century infrastructure feel engineered for conditions that didn't exist yet? There are three broad interpretations. The first is conventional. Victorian-era governments were ambitious, well-funded, and committed to long-term planning. They overbuilt because they believed in progress. They anticipated growth and constructed accordingly. The unexplained rooms were administrative overflow, future expansion, or simple documentation gaps. The records were lost, burned, or never formalized. What looks like mystery is just incomplete archival survival. It's the most widely accepted explanation, and for most individual cases it works. The second interpretation suggests inherited infrastructure. That some of what was built in the 1800s wasn't built from scratch, but represented the completion, adaptation, or reoccupation of earlier systems, possibly from a more coordinated prior phase of development. Under this view, the unexplained rooms weren't forgotten. They were repurposed. The original functions were phased out or replaced, and new administrative frameworks simply didn't retroactively document what had come before. It doesn't require a lost civilization. It requires a gap. A period where infrastructure existed, was used, and then transitioned into new hands without full continuity of record. The third interpretation is procedural. It suggests the uniformity reflects shared engineering standards that spread faster than we assume, through professional networks, published guidelines, or institutional mimicry. That cities copied each other. That what looks like coordination was actually convergence. Independent administrators, facing similar problems, arrived at similar solutions and scaled them optimistically. All three models acknowledge the same evidence. They differ only in what they believe that evidence represents. And none of them can be definitively proven from the buildings alone. What brings us back to 1816, the year without a summer. Volcanic winter from Mount Tambora, crop failures, mass migration, social disruption across Europe and North America. But also, the beginning of the largest sustained infrastructure boom in modern history. Within 10 years, the Erie Canal was underway. Within 20, rail networks began stretching across 2 continents. Within 30, cities were being rebuilt with water systems, gas lines, administrative complexes, and civic architecture on a scale that dwarfed anything prior. The official story is that industrialization enabled it. Steam power, capital investment, population growth. But if you flip the lens, you could ask a different question. What if the infrastructure enabled industrialization? What if the systems were already there, or partially there, and what followed was activation, expansion, and formalization? It's not a claim. It's a framing. And it doesn't resolve the unexplained rooms. It doesn't explain the over-engineered canals or the undersized populations or the administrative buildings with futures built into their floor plans. It just invites a different kind of attention. To the physical evidence. To the records that exist and the records that don't. To the buildings we walk through every day that hold more space than their documented purposes require. The word Tartaria, in this context, isn't meant to invoke a hidden empire. It's a metaphor. A way of naming the gap between what was built and what was written down. Between the scale of the infrastructure and the size of the society it supposedly served. Whether that gap reflects optimism, inheritance, or something else, Whether it's a documentation problem, a historical transition, or a pattern we're only beginning to recognize remains open. What's not open is the evidence itself. The rooms exist, the systems were built, the timing clusters, and the questions that emerge from walking through a 19th century courthouse, counting the doors, checking the blueprints, and finding spaces that appear in only one of those records. Those questions don't require belief. They just require attention. And perhaps that's all the documentary can offer. Not answers. Not conclusions. Just the invitation to look more carefully at the buildings we've stopped noticing, and to ask what they were built to hold.